Welcome back to the show. We're talking about sanctions and whether or not they work. Joining me now in the studio is Sergey Aleksashenko. He is a former deputy chairman of the Central Bank of Russia, and he's currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Also with us here in Washington is Simon de Galbert. He is a visiting fellow with the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to both of you to the show. Sergey, let me start with you. Russia has also been hit with sanctions by the United States and by the European Union. The Western powers accuse Russia of interfering in Ukraine. How have these sanctions impacted Russia's economy?
They did impact it. They did impact it because Russia is banned from Western financial markets, and despite under sanctions formally we see only a list of Russian state-owned companies and state-owned banks. Russian Federation, Russian Ministry of Finance itself decided to borrow this spring in the markets and was denied. So that means that Russia is really blocked from its access to financial markets, and Russia needs to repay a significant amount as foreign debt service. Last year it was about 5% of GDP. This year it will be 4% of GDP. That means a country has to keep current account surplus and to deliver all profits, also surplus, to pay foreign debt. So it's really heavy withdrawal of the financial resources of the country. So that's impacted, but I would not overestimate. I would not overestimate. It's not as huge, and definitely it is a factor that affects the economy, but it's not the dominant factor that explains why Russian economy is in decline.
Simon, let's talk about Iran. Here is a country that has endured sanctions for many, many years. But there was a nuclear deal last year, and most of the sanctions have been lifted. Was it diplomacy or sanctions that got Iran to the negotiating table?
I would say that it would be a combination of both. I think sanctions were critical to create a significant leverage on Iran and to convince Iran of its interest to make compromises on the advancements of its nuclear program. Obviously, sanctions aren't a magical stone. It's not that if you put it on the table, it will immediately solve the problems. You have to negotiate to get to the joint plan of action. But I'm not sure you get to that point without sanctions in the first place. In particular, I think that the fact that the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council were able to agree on a set of sanctions from 2006 onwards, and then the United States and the European Union and others were able to impose even harsher sanctions, was a critical contribution to create this diplomatic environment. And you can see that in the context of the Iranian domestic politics. Sanctions were one of the most critical pieces that were discussed in the presidential campaign in Iran in 2013.
Right, it may have hurt Iranian business interests, it may have hurt the Iranian economy, but did it also hurt European companies?
Of course. Sanctions do hurt the country that is sanctioned, but necessarily it also hurt the country that sanctions. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a political call, and the call in Europe and in most of the European countries was that the cost of seeing this situation deteriorate to the point where a diplomatic resolution might not be in the cards anymore. This cost was deemed to be much more significant than the economic cost that sanctions would put on European companies that were able most of the time to adapt, to find new clients. Some of them were in a more difficult situation, but governments are here to help in that situation. So of course there is a cost, and there is a need to explain why the sanctions are put in place. But the political objective, I think, was even more significant here.
Sergey, when we look at the sanctions that were imposed against Russia, do you think that the United States and Europe were in agreement on the sanctions that would be imposed and how they would be imposed? Because we know that Russia does more business with European countries than it does with the United States.
The most effect of the sanctions was the unity within Europe itself and between Europe and the United States. And that is maybe the most important political message to Russia and to Russian leadership. And definitely, United States and the American economy is much less affected by sanctions because the economic ties between Russia and the U.S. are relatively small compared to the ties between Russia and Europe. And of course, American companies suffer much less from the sanctions than European ones. And I think that American politicians would be in favor of more tougher sanctions. For example, we may look that Russian oil companies, they are under sanctions, while Russian gas, Gazprom or Novatek, both the big companies, they are not under sanctions because Europe is strongly dependent on Russian gas. And definitely Europe is much more interested in continuing business with Gazprom and continuing stable supply of gas. And that's why there is a conflict of interests, and there was a mutual agreement. Yeah, and as I understood, somewhere in September 2014, there was a decision by US and Europeans that we will not impose new sanctions, but we'll keep current sanctions in place. Sorry, we will not eliminate sanctions. So our main goal is to keep stability.
There is some talk, Simon, of these sanctions being lifted in the summer, in the next few months, against Russia. Is that going to happen?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is that so far, I think the Europeans have been able to renew the sanctions, which are bound to a 6-time limitation, which means that they have to be renewed every 6 months by unanimity. And so you need to have 28 countries agreeing to renew the sanctions for an additional period of time. So far, so good. I think as long as the Minsk agreement is not fully implemented, I don't really see the Europeans changing their position. Of course, there is pressure, because as Alexei said, the economic cost of those sanctions are on the European shoulders for the most part. And so there is pressure. But I think unity so far has remained, and I don't see, without a significant change in the situation on the ground in Ukraine, European unity dissolving itself.
Right.
So we'll see what happens in June and July. The decision is due in July. But I'm confident that the Europeans will make the right decision.
I want to move to another country now, which has borne the brunt of sanctions for decades. That is Cuba, mainly sanctions from the United States. President Obama has said the whole sanctions regime against Cuba has failed, although the embargo still remains in place. Is Cuba a classic case that tells us sanctions don't work?
I'm not a specialist of the Cuban case. What I can tell you is that...
But the principle of imposing sanctions.
But I think that, generally speaking, what the Cuban case shows is that when sanctions are shared by the wide range of actors internationally, that is not by the US only, sanctions are obviously more effective. And so, as you said, I think US sanctions by themselves on Cuba haven't been able to change the nature of the regime as they were, I think, intended to do so. And the lesson of Iran and sanctions, I think, is that sanctions shared more widely are necessarily more efficient.
There was worldwide sanctions. Sergey?
I would disagree. I would disagree. I think that sanctions on Cuba did play the role. I've been there, and I may tell you that the living standards in Cuba are very poor. And the people suffer, the economy is in disaster, and in ordinary shops for ordinary Cuban people, it's a shortage of everything. Yeah, and you cannot purchase basic goods. The dual currency system, you have non-convertible and convertible pesos. So it's really a disaster. It's really a disaster. And despite many European companies, they started to invest in Cuba. There are some good hotels in Havana. But if you compare, let's say, Yucatan, Cancun in Mexico resorts with Cuba, you can see the difference.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that the motivation to end sanctions came from the United States, not from Cuba.
I would say motivation to end sanctions came from the United States, but on the other hand, Cuban leadership said that we are going to move, we are going to change the policy, we are going to change the economy. So it's, I would say, mutual agreement, because both countries believe that good relations, good economic relations would benefit. Moreover, I would say that today Cuba is definitely not a fan of communist ideology, is not a fan of proponing communism somewhere in Latin America. So it's poor country, poor Latin American country that is looking for investment. I
want to get to a point on that, actually. North Korea has accused the United States of using sanctions to subdue other countries. In fact, there was a report in a Chinese news agency, Xinhua, quoting the North Korean foreign minister, and he said that sanctions have become a root cause of unreasonable pressure inequality and tensions. Do countries like the United States use sanctions to oppress other countries?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course, because definitely if we take the case with Iran, it was sanctions against the nuclear program. If we take case in Russia, it's against aggression in Europe, it's against invasion, it's against withdrawing territorial borders in Europe. If it's sanctions against North Korea, the same. Nuclear, its behavior and its punishment, we may say sanctions is a punishment for the behavior, misappropriate behavior. Yes, it is. But, okay, Russia joined sanctions against North Korea, Russia joined sanctions against Iran. So it's not only the United States. Sanctions against Iran were imposed by United Nations. We should not forget it.
Right.
And if I may,
sure.
Russia has recently sanctioned Turkey, which demonstrate, I think, that economic coercion has been forever a tool of foreign policy. It's a fact that the United States has relied recently more on economic sanctions, and you know, even the most closest U.S. allies have argued about sometimes the overreach of U.S. sanctions.
Tell me very quickly, Simon, I've only got 30 seconds. Sanctions have become part of diplomacy right now. They're not either or. It's not either sanctions or diplomacy. They just are being used as a diplomatic tactic.
Sure. I mean, it's a tool of diplomacy. In the sense that diplomacy is a way to deal with disagreements short of the use of military force. And so if coercion short of military force can be used, we all agree that it will always be preferable to resorting to the use of force.
If you like what you just saw, follow us on social media and visit our website, cctv-america.com.